A violent snowstorm had taken over the mountains, turning the once beautiful landscape into a dangerous white wilderness. Thick snow covered the narrow trails, the trees bent under the weight of ice, and the freezing wind moved through the valley like a warning from nature itself. Emily had never imagined that a simple hiking trip would turn into a fight for survival. She had come to the mountains searching for peace after months of stress in her busy city life. The fresh air, the quiet forests, and the breathtaking views had seemed like the perfect escape. She had planned everything carefully, carrying enough supplies for a few days and following the marked trails. But mountains had their own rules. On the second day of her trip, a dark cloud suddenly covered the sky. The weather changed faster than she expected. A strong storm arrived, covering the paths with snow and making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Emily tried to stay calm. She checked her map, adjusted her backpack, and decided to return to the nearest ranger station. But as the snow became heavier, she realized she had lost her way. Her phone showed no signal. The battery was nearly empty. The cold was becoming unbearable. Still, she kept walking. "I just need to find shelter," she whispered to herself, trying to stay hopeful. Hours passed. Her boots sank deep into the snow with every step. Her fingers became numb despite wearing gloves, and the freezing wind cut through her jacket. Then she saw something ahead. A small wooden bridge crossing a narrow frozen river. Emily felt a moment of relief. If she could cross the river, she believed she might find a path leading back towards civilization. She carefully stepped onto the bridge. The old wood creaked beneath her feet. Snow covered the surface, making each step slippery. She moved slowly, holding onto the railing while the storm continued to rage around her. Halfway across, she heard a strange cracking sound. She stopped. For a second, everything became silent except the sound of the wind. Then the ice beneath the bridge gave way. Emily barely had time to scream before she fell into the freezing water below. The shock was immediate. The icy river surrounded her body like thousands of sharp needles. She gasped, but the cold water stole her breath. Her heavy clothes pulled her downward as the current dragged her beneath the surface. She fought desperately. Her hands searched for something to grab, but there was nothing. Panic began to take over. She thought about her family, her friends, and all the things she still wanted to do in life. She wanted to scream, but the freezing water filled her with fear. Above her, the storm continued as if nothing had happened. No one knew where she was. No one knew she needed help. But someone did hear her. Far away from the river, deep inside the mountains, Jack was returning to his cabin. Jack had lived alone in the wilderness for years. The locals in nearby villages knew him as the mountain man who rarely came into town. Some people thought he was strange, while others respected him for his knowledge of the forest and his ability to survive harsh conditions. He preferred the quiet. The mountains had become his home. That evening, Jack was carrying firewood back to his cabin when he stopped suddenly. The wind had carried a sound through the trees. A scream. It was faint, almost impossible to hear over the storm, but Jack trusted his instincts. He looked toward the direction of the river. Something was wrong. Without wasting time, he dropped the firewood and grabbed his emergency supplies. He moved quickly through the deep snow, following the sound. The journey was difficult. The storm pushed against him, branches hit his face, and the cold made every movement harder. But Jack continued. He knew the mountains. He knew that every second mattered. When he finally reached the frozen river, his heart sank. He saw Emily struggling in the water. Without hesitation, Jack rushed forward. "Hold on," he shouted. Emily could barely hear him. Her strength was disappearing. Her body was becoming weaker with every passing second. Jack took off his heavy jacket, tied a rope around himself, and carefully moved closer to the broken ice. The surface cracked beneath him, but he didn't stop. He reached out his hand. "Look at me," he yelled. "You're going to get out of there." Emily lifted her eyes and saw him. A stranger. Someone who had come through the storm just to save her. With the last of her strength, she reached for his hand. Jack grabbed her tightly. The current pulled against them, but he refused to let go. Using all his strength, he pulled her toward the edge of the river. It took everything he had. Slowly, painfully, he dragged her out of the freezing water and onto the snow. Emily lay there shaking uncontrollably. Jack immediately wrapped her in his coat. "You need to stay awake," he told her. She looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who found you at the right time," he answered. "But why did you come back for me?" she asked weakly. "You could have gotten hurt too." Jack looked toward the endless forest surrounding them. "Because nobody deserves to die alone in these mountains." Those words stayed with Emily. Even through the cold and fear, she noticed something in his voice. Sadness. Jack wasn't just a man who lived alone. He was someone who had become comfortable with loneliness. He lifted her carefully and carried her through the snow toward his cabin. The journey felt endless, but Jack didn't stop. Inside the small wooden cabin, he started a fire immediately. He gave Emily warm blankets and prepared hot tea while making sure she stayed conscious. As the flames filled the room with warmth, Emily slowly opened her eyes. For the first time since falling into the river, she felt safe. She looked around the simple cabin and then at Jack, who quietly sat near the fire. The man who had saved her life lived completely alone in the middle of nowhere. And somehow, she felt that while he had rescued her from the freezing river, there was another kind of coldness inside him that needed healing too. The storm kept Emily inside Jack's cabin for several days. The mountains were still covered in thick snow, and the dangerous paths made it impossible for her to leave. At first, she felt like a prisoner, but slowly she began to see the beauty of the quiet place. Jack's cabin was simple. There were wooden walls, a small fireplace, a table near the window, and shelves filled with old books. Everything inside showed the life of a man who had learned to depend only on himself. Jack spent his days chopping wood, preparing food, and taking care of the cabin. He rarely spoke unless necessary. Emily noticed that he always stayed busy, as if he was trying to avoid thinking about something painful. One evening, while they sat near the fire, Emily finally asked, "Have you always lived here alone?" Jack looked into the flames for a long moment before answering. "No. Not always." His voice became quieter. "I had a different life once." Emily listened as Jack shared pieces of his past. Years earlier, he had lived in a small town surrounded by people who cared about him. He had a family, friends, and a home filled with laughter. But after losing the people closest to him, the world felt empty. He left everything behind and disappeared into the mountains. "I thought being alone would make the pain easier," Jack admitted. "I was wrong. It only made the silence louder." Emily looked at the man sitting across from her. The person everyone saw as a strong mountain survivor was also someone carrying years of sadness. "You saved my life," she said softly. "But who saved yours?" Jack gave a small, uncertain smile. "I don't think anyone can." Emily shook her head. "I think everyone deserves someone who reminds them they matter." For the first time, Jack looked at her differently. During the following days, Emily became part of the cabin's quiet rhythm. She helped prepare meals, organize the old books, and even convinced Jack to repair parts of the cabin he had ignored for years. Little by little, the lonely cabin began to feel different. There was conversation. There was laughter. There was warmth. Jack started smiling more. He shared stories about the mountains, taught Emily how to recognize animal tracks, then showed her the hidden beauty of the wilderness. Emily realized that Jack wasn't a lonely man because he disliked people. He was lonely because he had stopped believing anyone would stay. When the snow finally began to melt and the roads became safe again, Emily knew the time had come to leave. She stood outside the cabin looking at the place where she had found safety. Jack quietly stood beside her. "I guess this is goodbye," he said. Emily looked at him and smiled. "No, Jack. This isn't goodbye." She took his hand and said, "You saved me from that frozen river. Now I'll save you from loneliness." Jack didn't say anything, but for the first time in many years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Months passed after Emily left the mountains, but the memories of Jack and the small cabin hidden among the snowy peaks never left her mind. She returned to her normal life, surrounded by people, noise, and endless responsibilities, but something felt different. She had experienced something rare in the mountains, a genuine connection with someone who expected nothing in return. Jack had saved her life without hesitation. Now she wanted to keep the promise she made to him. One morning, Emily packed her bags and traveled back to the mountains. She carried supplies, books, and a few things she thought would make Jack's lonely cabin feel more like a home. When she reached the cabin, Jack was outside cutting wood. He froze when he saw her standing there. For a moment, he looked surprised, as if he couldn't believe someone had returned for him. "Emily," he said quietly. She smiled. "I told you I wasn't saying goodbye." Jack looked away, trying to hide the happiness in his eyes. He had spent years believing people always left. But Emily had come back. And that changed everything. Over the next few weeks, the cabin transformed. Emily planted flowers near the entrance, added warmth to the rooms, then filled the silence with stories and laughter. Jack slowly began opening his heart again. He started visiting nearby villages, talking to people he had avoided for years, and sharing his knowledge of the mountains. The man who once hid from the world was finally becoming part of it again. One evening, they sat outside watching the sunset spread across the mountains. "I used to think this place was my escape," Jack said. "But now I realize I was hiding." Emily smiled. "Sometimes people hide because they are afraid of losing something again." Jack looked at her. "And you?" Emily laughed softly. "I was afraid too. But I learned that some people are worth taking a chance on." The mountain wind moved gently around them, but neither of them felt the cold. Jack had once believed his life would always be empty. He thought the mountains would be his only companion forever. But then a woman fell into a frozen river, and a rescue that saved her life ended up saving his too. Emily had promised to save him from loneliness, and she kept that promise. The cabin was no longer a place of silence. It became a place filled with kindness, memories, and hope. Years later, people in the nearby villages still told the story of the mountain man who saved a woman from a frozen river. But they also told another part of the story. A story about how one person's kindness can change another person's life. Because sometimes the greatest rescue isn't pulling someone from danger. Sometimes it is reminding them that they are not meant to walk through life alone.